Hey there, interwebs. As you may know, I personally consider the quarterstaff to be the best weapon for the pseudo-medieval fantasy traveler, but does that mean I think the big stick is the best weapon for all situations? No, of course not. It all comes down to, at the risk of summoning Matt Easton, context. The context of travel, for example, demands a weapon which is simple, lightweight, and multifunctional. Today, I believe I've found the best weapon for someone in a different context. This could be the best weapon for revolting peasants. Interpret that adjective as you will, for now. So, what is this fantastic weapon, you may be wondering? This is a Goedendag. It's a simple yet unusual weapon from 14th century Flanders, where it was used to great effect by Flemish tradies against French nobility in the Gulden Sporenslag, or Battle of the Golden Spurs. Although one theory posits that the name has Germanic roots, meaning good dagger, it's generally believed that the name comes from Dutch for good day, a cognate for the German Guten Tag. The story goes that the guildsmen of Bruges took to the streets armed with these weapons and a deadly shibboleth. They supposedly greeted people, and then murdered anyone who answered in a French accent. The veracity of this lore is dubious, but the weapons themselves are sound. In fact, I personally believe they've been tragically underappreciated, and there's a Shadiversity video from back when they were still worth watching where he gives the Goedendag the credit it deserves. Setting history aside for the moment to examine the heart of the matter, this weapon combines elements of a club and a spear, as you can see, by fixing a metal spike and cap on top of a stout wooden haft. Obviously, a sturdy 3 to 5 foot length of wood is a perfectly effective weapon on its own, but the metal hardware of the Goedendag magnifies its bludgeoning effect, since it is, at the end of the day, additional mass on the business end. It also improves its thrusting capabilities, of course, but unlike a spearhead or simply whittling on a point, this hard shoulder is thought to prevent over-penetration, functioning somewhat like the wings on a boar spear or the fantastically named Bohemian ear spoon. Unfortunately, you can't make an effective Goedendag just by ramming a spike into the end of a wooden shaft. You also have to include a cap or collar, which Shad discovered by neglecting to do so, but more on that later. Changing gears for a moment, this is a disc mace, and this is a more traditional, less pun-friendly design of the same weapon. Just like the Goedendag, it's simple but effective, and I feel it too is underappreciated. Swords, as almost everyone knows, require lots of training and practice to use effectively. Axes are a fair bit simpler, but still require knowledge of edge alignment and recovery after a swing. Radially symmetric weapons like clubs, maces, quarterstaffs, and Goedendags, however, are about as simple as it gets, and I'd wager that a mob of unruly peasants could be effectively trained in their use in the space of an afternoon. Furthermore, unlike clubs and studded or flanged maces, sharpened disc maces also confer some of the hooking and chopping capabilities of an axe, again without concern for edge alignment. On the other hand, they lack the axe's ability to slash or slice deeply into a target, but back on the first hand, they can still chop deeply enough, and there's less risk of over-penetration in getting the head stuck in the target. I could go on at length about the strengths of Goedendags and disc maces, but I think you grasp the salient points. They're simple, but brutally effective at ruining someone's day. Skalagrim has an excellent video on the latter topic, and in it he speculates about the possibility of adding a Goedendag-like spike to the end of one. He also then immediately follows it up with pictures of these Goedendags, which have wide oblate collars, thus proving the old maxim nihil sub sole novum, there's nothing new under the sun. Now, if you were paying any attention at all during the introduction of this video, you won't be surprised when I tell you that this design is actually quite ingenious. As a matter of fact, I think the Goedendag disc mace, or Goedendisk as I will henceforth be calling it, could even be one of those rare examples where the combination weapon is actually more useful than the sum of its parts. This is because the Goedendag spike adds a thrusting capability to the mace, and the mace head makes the Goedendag more effective at, well, everything. Obviously, it improves its bludgeoning ability, but it can also double as a rondel guard for thrusting, especially if you hold the Goedendisk in a sort of half-sorting grip. It also functions as a simple collar to reinforce the shaft. You see, Shad's mock Goedendag failed because when he used it like a club, the mass and resultant momentum of the spike cracked the wood, allowing the spike to fly out. If, however, it were also fitted with a mace head, that would secure the shaft. The centripetal force of swinging the mace and the abrupt halt of thrusting into targets would only serve to seat the mace head on further, which would then cause the shaft to grip the spike more firmly. It's not often that shafts are the ones doing the firm grasping, am I right? Innuendos aside, this combination weapon can stab, smash, hook, block, and even cut to an extent, although it's more of a chop than a slice. You can even hold it in a sort of half-sorting grip for anti-armor fighting, and the disc would act as a hand stop like the hilt of a rondel dagger. You can also stab, smash, hook, and block with a spiked mace, especially if it has a particularly pronounced top spike, such as these historical examples from India, but there are two major differences. First, I'd be worried about those spikes getting caught on things like clothing and flexible armor or stuck in targets, but second, and even more critically, a spiked mace like this would require a lot of skill and time to produce. Don't forget that equally as important as a weapon's capability is its availability. The mediocre weapon that you can have 100 of by this afternoon is, in certain contexts, far more useful than the amazing weapon that you can have 1 of next month. As the old saying goes, quantity is a quality of its own, and the Goedendag is so cheap and dead simple to make that you can have it in any quantity you need. Just hammer a lump of metal into a roughly flat circular shape, drift or punch a hole, and clean up the edge. Then hammer out a spiked rod real quick, slap the two things together on a wood haft, and hey-ho, you're good to go. Depending on the size of the mace head, you could put it on multiple different lengths of shaft, thus allowing you to make the Goedendag either a one- or two-handed weapon, to be used either in conjunction with a shield or on its own. Any competent blacksmith worth their soot could bang one out in a few hours, at most. I know, because I asked one. You could also make the disc as a bronze casting, which, while not as strong as iron, would be a more efficient method of production if you need to crank out a whole bunch of them, like, say, for example, if you're arming a peasant's revolt. Actually, let's really think about a peasant's revolt for a moment. First of all, who are they going to be fighting? It's not going to be the other peasants, it's going to be the local nobility. You know, knights. And what do we all associate with knights? That's right, shining armor. Fortunately for our revolting peasants, but unfortunately for our knights, the Goedendag is about as good of an anti-armor weapon as anyone could want. Although it depends on the exact geometry, material, and hardness of the top spike, it should be able to stab through mail, padded gambeson, and maybe even thin, unhardened plates, or at least the gaps between them. This means that despite the weapon's name, if you're a knight, you are not going to have a good day. Lastly, there is one other combination weapon add-on which I want to mention, due to its being related to the Goedendag. A couple years ago at this point, I created a D&D character who wields a Goedendag with the end wrapped in a spiked chain, making it akin to a pseudo-medieval barbed wire bat or nail bat, which is really just a poor man's morning star in any time period. I may have taken inspiration from Roy Greenhilt's ad hoc club, but honestly I don't recall for certain. Covering the end of a hafted weapon in spikes also has a certain defensive aspect. Whenever you're fighting someone who is wielding a polearm, one of the strategies you can employ is to grab the end of the shaft near the head and use that to control the opponent's weapon. If it's covered in spikes, however, suddenly that option's off the table. In Edo, Japan, law enforcement officers were proficient in the use of the Torimono Sandogu, or 3 tools of arresting, and these polearms have barbs on their shafts just below the head precisely to stop people from grabbing them. You could theoretically add haft spikes to the end of your Goedendag as well, for the same reason. And that pretty much brings an end to this video. If you have any further thoughts on the Goedendag, feel free to let me know about them in the comments below. Hopefully, I've given at least one fantasy writer or dungeon master out there something to consider for their next peasant uprising. As always, thanks for watching, and have a Goedendag. Behind the scenes fun fact. When I was first working on this script back in January, I decided to postpone it so I'd have more time to work on it. Less than a week later, the Modern Rogue came out with their own Goedendag video. That's what I get for delaying, I guess.